We talked about the large-scale conjecturing, but also we have the item of memory. Now, of course, memory is not perfect. We all forget things. We misremember things. At least that's what my wife tells me. I didn't get that right. And my wife has a better memory than me on a lot of things. She can remember details on things a lot better than I can, like what was said at certain times by a certain person. Memory, I got you on that. Yeah, I understand what you're saying here with your laughs. But memory is generally reliable. Now, several years ago, I was in a doctor's office, and I just had an appointment. I came out of the office, and I'm walking out, and the office is just jammed with other patients. And there was this one guy, he was an old guy, and he was wearing his baseball cap, and it had a B-29 Superfortress embroidered in it. So he's a World War II vet. And my wife and I, we love World War II stuff. We just can't get enough of it, watching documentaries and movies on World War II. And so I saw this guy, and I'm thinking, that's just amazing. And I walked out of the doctor's office, and then I just couldn't let it go. And so I came back in, and I walked up to the guy, and I said, "Sir, did you fly on a B-29 in World War II?" And he said, "I sure did, son." I said, "Wow, you must have some amazing stories." And he said, "Yeah, I was in the Pacific Theater, and I'll never forget the native women on the island on which we were stationed. They had a horrible odor to them." So here he was, decades later, more than half a century later, and he could remember that these women stunk. How many of you were old enough to remember 9/11? Okay, lots of you. Do you remember what the weather was like on that day? What was it? Well, of course, it's Tucson, Sunny. It was sunny everywhere in the U.S., okay? Here it is. You remember what the weather was like on 9/11 19 years ago. Now, how many of you remember what the weather was like September 11th this year, just a little over a month ago? Yeah, it was hot. It's Tucson. Yeah. Okay, but I ask this almost anywhere else in the country, and they'll say, I don't know. Why is it that we can remember what the weather was like on 9/11 19 years ago, but we can't remember, you can, of course, down here in Tucson, but we can't remember what it was like a little over a month ago, 5 weeks ago? Because we tend to remember things in which either we were involved or that impact us emotionally. In November 1965, you had a battle at the Ia Drang River Valley in Vietnam. It was the first engagement of U.S. forces with North Vietnamese Army. This is recounted in the movie We Were Soldiers, starring Mel Gibson and Sam Elliott. And it was based on a book written by Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore, that's represented by Mel Gibson in the movie, and Joe Galloway, who was a combat reporter. They wrote a book, and then the movie was made out of it. And so it talks about these harrowing 5 days of battle that took place. There were a lot of American casualties involved, and it's a great story. It's a fantastic movie. And so Joe Galloway, this combat reporter, the real one appeared in a documentary called Vietnam in HD. And my wife and I were watching this a few years ago, and in the very first episode, he appears there, and he's talking about his experience during those 5 days. And at one point, he says something. It's a 1-minute clip, and I said, that's amazing. And so I got that 1-minute clip I want to show you. Here it is. Let's say that you had been with Jesus, you had traveled with him. Maybe you were one of his disciples, maybe you were one of the women followers, and you had actually seen him give sight to a guy who had been born blind. You saw him take a person who had been paralyzed for years and heal him so that he could get up and take up his bed and walk. You saw him walk on water. You saw him raise a dead person. You saw him engage the Jewish leadership in arguments. You saw him crucified, and shortly after, you saw him raised from the dead and in perfect health. Do you think that that would leave an impression on you that was as deep and lasting as those 5 days had on Joe Galloway? That's Jesus' deeds. What about his words? You know, most of us don't think about this, but Jesus was an itinerant preacher. He's not like my friend Adam, a pastor who was very kind and bought me a cup of coffee before here. And Adam, as a pastor, he's got to come up with a new sermon every week, a different sermon every week. An itinerant speaker like myself, Frank Turk, we were talking about this the other day, my buddy Frank. He said, you know, we've got maybe a dozen or so talks, and we just give them the same talk in Tucson as we gave and wherever we were the week before or the month before that. We give the same ones. We don't have to come up with a new talk every time because it's a different audience every time. Jesus was an itinerant speaker. He probably had a dozen or so messages, and he taught those messages over and 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 over. And of course, his disciples, then he sends them out because they've heard him all these times, and you've heard the best way to learn something is to teach it. Some of them probably took notes. It could very well be that Matthew took notes. He took down the teachings of Jesus, and that is the Q source we have. I think there's a good possibility of that. You've got this, they hear it, they go out, and they're teaching the same things over and 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 over. They come back, they debrief Jesus, and he says, hey guys, guess what? Now let's go to our next level. Do you know that when you're talking to Gentiles, you can adjust these parables a little bit and the stories in order to do a cultural translation and appeal to them more and communicate with them better than when you're dealing with Jews, because you can just change up things? And so he teaches them, and he says the same stuff over and over and over and over and over. And then he rises from the dead. He leaves them after a while. And now for the next several decades, they're teaching the same things over and over. And you get the message. You get the idea. Jesus' teachings is not something they heard just once and they're trying to recall 35 years later. They're teaching this stuff all the way up until the time, and even after the Gospels are being written. Patrick Henry's famous liberty or death speech. Do you know that there's only 2 eyewitnesses of that who recounted them later? There's no notes that have survived from Patrick Henry of what he said on that day. The only way we know what he said are 2 eyewitnesses who were trying to recall it from memory 41 years later. Now, maybe he said, give me liberty or give me death and so forth. But the rest of it has been reconstructed based on their memories. They've taken it, and the guy who reconstructed it took a lot of liberties in reconstructing what that actual was said in that. He's given us a gist of what occurred based on what those 2 eyewitnesses were recounting 41 years later. I can tell you that we can have more confidence that the Gospels are preserving what Jesus said than when we read about Patrick Henry's liberty or death speech. That's pretty cool. So they were certainly capable of reporting accurate history.